Have you ever felt like the backup version of someone else's dream? Like you were only noticed when someone else failed to show up? This story isn't about a princess or a perfect life. It's about you. It's about the quiet ones, the observers, the ones who were told to be grateful for leftovers and stay in the background. But what if your silence carried more truth than their legacy ever did? This story was written for you. If you've ever been overlooked, underestimated, or asked to play a role that wasn't yours, listen closely, because today the girl behind the curtain takes the stage. I was born during the monsoon. They said the roof of the East Annex leaked so much that my mother gave birth to the sound of dripping water and servants muttering curses under their breath. I was told this not as a memory, but as a joke, something my aunt would mention at dinners when the room grew too quiet. A child born where the tiles give way. How fitting. The Hay estate was all polished marble and hollow praise. There were rooms here that I wasn't allowed to step into. Portraits I wasn't permitted to gaze at for too long. Jiran's rooms were at the front of the house, basking in morning light. Mine were tucked behind the kitchen gardens where the smell of boiled turnips clung to the windows. They said it was only fair, she was the heir after all. And I was the backup. They never used the word aloud, but it hung in the air between their glances, their instructions, their silence when I entered a room. Jiren was the real daughter, groomed with fine silks and social tutors and art masters who praised her for copying line for line what they'd shown her. She smiled with perfect teeth and danced like a banner in spring wind. She was born to be looked at. I was not. My name, Neirun, was rarely spoken beyond the servants' halls. Aunt Hay once slipped and called me the other one in front of the minister's wife. That night, I sketched her on a stolen sheet of Jiren's calligraphy paper, giving her 1,000 jeweled teeth and a neck long enough to choke on. I sold the piece in the East Market under my alias. Yun. I liked how that name felt in the mouths of strangers. Short. Unclaimed. It didn't carry the weight of bloodlines or porcelain manners. It was a name you could disappear into. In the deepest corner of the city's underground, Yun was known for crooked smiles and truth-skewered ink. My drawings cut through the pretty layers of the nobility, mocking their duplicity with curved lines and caricatured sin. The nobles laughed at them in public and paid for their removal in private. Sometimes they threatened arrest. Once, a scroll of mine was burned in a public square, the flames licking at my fake seal as the crowd jeered. They didn't know it was me. No one did. Not even Jiran, though she once held up a Yun piece at a salon gathering and sighed, "What a bitter little artist, always drawing things uglier than they are." I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. I drew exactly what I saw. By day, I studied in the leftover hours Jiran's tutors couldn't fill. By night, I slipped past the guards and ducked into alley booths where buyers waited with gloved hands and lanterns low. Sometimes I went to the printing den near the Lantern River, where I'd sit among inkwells and boiling copper plates, listening to dissidents and poets argue over verses and layouts. My art sat beside theirs in secret corners of rebellion. And yet, I remained unknown, unloved, unseen, until the news came. 3 days before the bridal approval dinner, the house shifted. I was sketching in the garden corridor, behind the old magnolia tree where the servants smoked, when the housekeeper's sharp voice cut across the stillness. "She's gone," she whispered. "Jiran is gone." My charcoal slipped, the line I was tracing down the edge of Daiwan's imagined shoulder, sharp, strong, unmarred by false metals. Jagged, suddenly. I didn't look up, but I felt my chest still. That name, said with fear, didn't belong to anyone else. "She ran off," another maid hissed. "With him?" The voices dropped to whispers. I leaned forward, breath shallow. "The foreign noble? The one from the Northern Trade Embassy. They slipped out through the East Gate at dawn. Is gone." My first thought was relief. Then dread. Then the housekeeper's next words struck like an ink blot over my life. "They've summoned the backup." My body went cold. My fingers curled instinctively over the edge of my sketchbook. They're bringing Narian forward, she said, for the dinner. A maid gasped. To replace Jiran? Only for the event, the housekeeper said bitterly. Only so General Daewon doesn't withdraw the match. I closed the sketchbook gently. The magnolia above me dropped a petal onto my knee. White, wide, perfect. I crushed it between my fingers and stood. The next hours unfolded like a painting I didn't sign. Aunt Hay refused to meet my eyes when she called me into the atrium. Her fingers, always adorned with rings, trembled as she poured me tea and explained that I would wear Jiran's second-best hanbok, that no one would question it, not at a formal engagement dinner, that I only needed to sit there, nod, smile once or twice. You're doing this for your family, she said, as if that word still included me. I said nothing. I couldn't tell her the truth. I'd rather be arrested for treason than wear Jirjan's perfume. I'd rather be Yoon in exile than Naryon in silk. But I nodded, because I saw the fear in her eyes, and because there was something darker in mine, something that whispered, let them see what they created. Let them dress the ghost and pray no one notices it's not their daughter. The dress fit too tightly across the chest, the shoes pinched. The maid who painted my lips did so with hands that shook. As I looked into the mirror, the reflection looking back at me was not mine. Her eyes were wide and calm, her mouth painted red, her hair twisted into court-ready braids. But inside, Yoon smiled. They had no idea what they were unleashing. That night, I stood by the paper doors of the guest courtyard and overheard the general's attendant confirming the message. General Seryun Daewon has accepted the invitation. He will arrive in 3 days. My breath caught. The real game had begun. And Jiran? Still gone. Or maybe she was the lucky one. His name echoed through the courtyard like an approaching storm. General Seryun Daewon, 3 days. That night I did not sleep. I lay in Jiran's bed, her silk sheets cold, her perfume cloying against my throat, staring up at the painted ceiling while my own name curled and shriveled in the corners of the room like smoke. They had stripped me of it the moment they fastened her jade earrings to my ears and said, "You'll do. From a distance, you could be her." From a distance. It was the kind of lie this family specialized in, meant to survive dinners, handshakes, headlines. And yet I said nothing, because something in me, maybe spite, maybe something quieter and hungrier, wanted to see what happened when a ghost wore silk and smiled. By the second day, the tailors had adjusted Jiran's wedding hanbok to fit my frame. My aunt's voice snapped through the dressing room as she instructed the seamstress on which ornaments to display, which not to mention. Her mouth moved like a conductor trying to compose a symphony from broken strings. I don't care if it bruises her ribs, the belt stays tight. General Daewon is known for noticing posture. I'd rather die standing than bow before him, I whispered under my breath. The seamstress flinched. My aunt did not hear me. She hadn't looked me in the eye since I was 12. The day of the dinner, the sun burned low and sullen behind layers of spring mist. I sat in the courtyard awaiting the general's arrival, my wrists aching from how tightly the sleeves were bound. Around me, the garden hummed with the forced elegance of arranged settings, jasmine watered too late in the season, petals scattered by overpaid servants. I stared at the lacquered tea set laid between us and thought, this is a stage. I am the prop. The doors opened. He stepped in. Seryun Daewon. He was taller than I expected, his movements precise, as if every step had been weighed for meaning. His eyes did not drift, they struck, and when they met mine across the distance, I felt them scrape away the paint. My pulse surged against the silk at my throat. He bowed with the cold courtesy of a man raised in halls sharper than swords. I mirrored it, hiding the quiver in my spine. Our first words were choreographed. Greetings, lineage, weather. He sat across from me, but the space between us felt like a chasm that could not be bridged by words, only wars. Then came the silence, the moment no script could fill. I reached for the tea. He spoke first. I was told Jiran played the lute. Why don't you have one in the garden? The porcelain trembled in my hands. I studied it, eyes lowered. It cracked last spring, I haven't replaced it. His brow furrowed. Not the answer Jiran would have given. A servant called us inside for the meal, interrupting the weight of his gaze. Later, when the dinner's formalities waned and wine replaced etiquette, I found myself drawn to the study, not by curiosity, but by breathlessness. I needed space. Space away from Aunt Hay's whispering advisors, from servants watching for errors, from Daiwan's unreadable stillness. The study was dim, lit by a single hanging lantern. The scent of ink and aged parchment clung to the air like memory. I found a war map laid open, territories marked in strokes so bold they felt violent. Without thinking, I reached for a charcoal stick resting nearby. My fingers knew the movements before my mind could catch up. I traced the eastern border, softening the hard lines, adjusting for terrain Daewon's cartographers had exaggerated. My hands worked like they did in the underground market stalls, quick, exact, unseen. Until a shadow fell over the map. It turned slowly. He stood there, one hand behind his back, the other resting on the doorframe. He didn't move, didn't speak. My heart clawed upward. I began... His voice sliced through the air. Why are you redrawing classified maps? I hesitated. I wasn't changing strategy. I was just studying composition. His gaze hardened. That map is not art. To me, it is. I stepped back, charcoal still in hand. Stupid, reckless. One more step and I'd be thrown out. Or worse. Panic rose in my throat like bile. Words spilled out before I could control them. If you send me away now, the baby's your responsibility. Silence. The air turned to glass. He did not blink. I could feel the edges of his judgment, the calculation flickering behind his eyes. Then, whose idea was that lie? He asked quietly. It wasn't anyone's. It wasn't planned. He studied me for a long moment. The corners of his mouth didn't twitch. There was no anger, just weariness. Icing. He stepped forward, took the map from the desk, and rolled it slowly, binding it with silk string. I held my breath. Then he turned, and without looking at me, said, "If you're going to lie, Ms. Hay, lie better." He walked out. The next morning, a footman arrived with a scroll bearing the ministry's seal. I unfolded it with shaking hands. General Daewon formally confirms engagement to Jiran of Hay. Child expected. I read the words twice. Then again. The ink didn't change. He had accepted the lie. He's using it. Political armor. A buffer against scandal. A maneuver. A message. I stood in Jiran's garden, dressed in Jiran's robes, and stared at the blossomless magnolia tree. Its branches like bones reaching skyward. The curtain had been lifted. And I was still here. The scroll still sat on the tea table when they came to retrieve me. It had not even dried fully. The calligraphy of child expected still glossy in the sunlight slanting through Jiran's latticed windows. I hadn't touched it again since reading it that morning. I didn't need to. The lie had already grown roots. It now wore my face. 2 guards arrived before dawn. Courteous, but stiff. They wore the Daewon estate insignia across their chests, silver lacquer against deep blue fabric, perfectly folded. They bowed. They didn't speak. Neither did I. The house was silent when I left. My aunt did not see me off. There was nothing left to explain. I was to be moved, trained, prepared. A bride in name, a vessel for expectations. I rode in silence between them, the palanquin veiled but unshuttered. Outside, I could hear merchants shouting over fruit prices, children chasing loose scrolls, and the rustle of every watching voice. She's the one. That's General Daewon's bride. The one they say is already expecting. They didn't know the truth. And still, somehow, neither did I. The estate loomed like a judgment. Daewon's residence wasn't a palace, though it could have been mistaken for one from afar. Its rooftops curved in disciplined symmetry, each tile the color of ash and ice. The courtyard was vast and deliberate. No flowering trees, only trimmed stone pines. It was a place designed not to seduce, but to remind you of your position. I stepped onto its grounds and felt the weight settle instantly. My feet touched stone. My identity vanished. From the moment I entered, they addressed me as Lady Jiren. The tutors arrived before my trunk had even been unpacked. Court conduct, tea ceremony, regional dialect corrections, marital posture. Their voices didn't rise, but their eyes pierced through everything I hadn't yet learned. You walk too quickly. You must be the breeze, not the storm. You speak too plainly. Jiran used to lace her words with honey, not ink. They didn't know the real Jiran had fled halfway across the continent. And I was neither breeze nor honey. I obeyed in silence. Every day I woke before the staff. Every evening I sat through etiquette drills until my knees went numb from kneeling. I said what I was told. I smiled when required. I nodded as they polished me into someone else's outline. But each night I unwrapped my hidden charcoal sticks, tucked into the lining of my sash, and drew my way back to Brett. I discovered the soldiers by accident. The lower courtyard was off-limits to the women's quarters, but I'd grown tired of memorizing the angle of tea lids and correct forms of laughter. I wandered, unseen, until the sound of muffled grunts and clashing wood pulled me toward the training square. They were sparring at dusk, their silhouettes stark against the dying light. Sweat gleamed on their shoulders, bandages bloomed fresh red beneath their uniforms. No audience, no ceremony, only bruises and breath. I sat behind the lattice wall, hidden in the shadows of an old pavilion, and began to sketch. One soldier's leg bent oddly during a kick. Old injury. Another favored his left side too much, likely shoulder tension. My hands moved without asking permission from the rest of me. I didn't hear the footsteps until the sparring ended. You don't flinch at bruises? His voice low, calm, edged like a blade half drawn. I turned. Daewon stood behind me, hands clasped behind his back, gaze focused on the sketchpad still resting on my lap. I didn't move to hide it. I was only observing, I said, the same way I'd said it before. He studied me for a long moment. And what did you see? That your soldiers are exhausted, and whoever's training them doesn't account for previous injuries. The silence stretched. Then his mouth curved, not into a smile, but into something unreadable, something almost like curiosity. I'll have your sketch delivered to the physician, he said, and turned to walk away. After that, things began to shift, quietly. Ink appeared on my desk. Fine paper followed, then a book on topographical shadowing. None of them bore his name, but they weren't from the servants either. They were precise, tailored, meant for me. Not for Jiran. I never thanked him, he never asked. But I started drawing more, not for the papers, not for politics. For the wounded man with the scar across his jaw who whispered his gratitude when I slipped him a drawing of how to tie his brace better. For the servant girl whose crooked fingers made folding cloth painful, until I showed her a gentler grip through images. For the soldiers who didn't know my name but started saluting when they passed the garden's edge. They thought I was Jiran. Yet they bowed with more than duty. Daewon kept his distance. He watched more than he spoke. From across corridors, at the end of dining tables, in the brief seconds before leaving a room. His presence always arrived before he did. The subtle hush of conversation, the alignment of posture, the way every surface seemed to reflect only what he wanted to see. And yet, I never felt afraid of him. Not like I had feared the ones who smiled too easily. He didn't ask questions he already knew the answers to. He left me ink instead. One evening, after a storm softened the grounds and the estate lamps were dimmed for the night, I sat alone in the western room, sketching. My brush traced careful lines, not satire, not soldiers, him. Daewon, not as a general, but as I had seen him once through the garden veil, back to the sun, hair tied loosely, a moment of stillness breaking across his brow like dawn. I captured the part of him no newspaper would ever print. No power, stillness, humanity. When the sketch was finished, I stared at it far longer than I should have. Then I folded it, slid it into the bottom of my drawer, beneath older pages, beneath safer lies. He could never see it. I couldn't explain what it meant, not yet. The sketch remained buried in the drawer. That night, I couldn't sleep. Rain tapped lightly against the paper screens, whispering through the bamboo-like breath through folded palms. Somewhere down the corridor, a servant's bell chimed faintly, the hour of deep rest. And yet my hands would not still. I opened the drawer again. The page looked back at me with unbearable softness. His posture had been relaxed that day, unaware of my eyes. His expression unreadable, as always, but not cold. The way I had drawn him made him look human. Fallible? Kind? A version of Daiwan that didn't belong to the world, or even to himself. A version that belonged only to me. Too honest to keep? I didn't know it yet, but I was already grieving the things I hadn't said. In the days that followed, something shifted. Whispers began to swell between the lattice doors and herb drying racks. When I passed through the side gardens, the maids paused their work mid-motion. Eyes glanced sideways. Fans fluttered too long. Lady Jiren's changed, one cook murmured as I lingered by the service well, pretending to smell the violets. She smiles at the guards now, listens to the wounded like she understands them. She corrected Lord Sejin's stance without flinching. No more demands, no more sighs, only silence. And sketches, another added. Do you think it's the pregnancy? A laugh. Or a trick. The truth stood behind their eyes, not their words. It wasn't Jiron, and they were beginning to know it. Daewon didn't ask questions, he never had, but he started to appear in the same spaces I occupied, always without announcement, never with direct intent. A moment before lunch, he'd linger on the outer veranda. At dusk, I'd pass through the training yard and find him there, speaking quietly with his captains. At night, when I sketched by moonlight, the flame of his lamp would still flicker down the hallway, long after the estate had folded into sleep. He never spoke first, and I never dared to start, yet I could feel it, that hum in the silence, the question forming in the space between his glances. Does he know? Or worse, is he pretending not to? I kept drawing, not just him, his soldiers. Their wounds, their laughter, the way they adjusted their grips on swords after I sent quiet suggestions through a servant's pouch. The kitchen girls said morale had improved, the quartermaster said injuries had decreased. No one thanked me aloud, but someone had replaced the broken paper lantern in the West Pavilion where I liked to sketch. Someone left dried apricots on my tray when I skipped supper. Someone placed a warmer brush beside my inkstone after I'd forgotten mine in the eastern courtyard. Over. He never said it was him. But I knew. One morning, I found myself alone in the summer chamber, painting the lines of a soldier's scar. It was an old injury across the jaw, twisting his smile, darkening his expression. I added Daewon's silhouette in the background, blurred, watching. A voice startled me mid-stroke. You draw wounds more tenderly than faces. I looked up. Daewon stood by the door, unarmored, dressed in a deep navy robe with his hair still damp. The rain had started again outside, lacing the paper windows with pale veins. I didn't reply. He stepped closer, eyes falling to the sketch. He didn't touch it. I recognized the shape of that scar. It's from your border campaign, isn't it? I asked softly. Against the Vosh encampments. He nodded once. Then, after a breath, said, he refused to be treated. Wouldn't let anyone see it for weeks. I looked back at the portrait. But you watched anyway. Our eyes met. It was not a romantic moment. It was something quieter, more dangerous. Recognition. You see me, I see you. He turned away before I could speak. You should not linger near the west walls tonight. Lightning will come in with the wind. And then he was gone. That night, I couldn't draw, not properly. My hand hesitated too often, my thoughts circling like moths around heat. The version of him I'd sketched days earlier, the soft one, half smiling, shoulders lowered, kept pulling at the corner of my mind. I opened the drawer again, and there he was. Not the general, the man. Slightly loose, eyes lost in thought, a line at the corner of his mouth that no one else would ever notice. Was too much. Too bare. Too mine. I lit the brazier. The flame crackled as I held the edge of the parchment over it. Smoke curled first, then the paper blackened, blistered, and folded in on itself. The moment disappeared before the first tear reached the charcoal. I watched until every trace of him turned to ash. And in the silence that followed, I felt something inside me do the same. The ash from his portrait still clung to my fingertips when the thunder broke. Not outside, but in the front courtyard. It began with sharp voices, the rustle of rushing feet, the sound of a gate crashing open without permission. I was standing by the half-drawn curtains of the ink room, watching the wind comb through the pines, when the hush inside the estate was pierced. A shriek of recognition. Lady Jiran? And then, I knew she wasn't you. The silence after was even louder. I didn't move. My heart, however, sank into my ankles. They arrived like a procession out of a painting. Jiran, dazzling in crimson, her fan clutched tightly in one hand, the other tangled intimately with the foreign noble she'd vanished with. His golden cufflinks caught the afternoon light. Her earrings glittered like declarations. She hadn't come back in shame. She'd come back to reclaim. I watched from behind the corner screen as servants bent hastily into bows and aides tripped over their greetings. Jiran didn't glance at them. Her eyes, lined in deep vermilion, scanned the estate with the smug precision of someone who had never lost anything she couldn't buy back. Then her gaze landed on me, and she smiled. It wasn't warmth, it was teeth. The confrontation didn't wait for the next morning. She stormed into the drawing room that night like a dagger unsheathed. I was seated on the far end, sketching by lantern light, the same spot I always claimed when the house quieted, when the walls stopped watching. I had barely lifted my eyes when she slammed the paper door open. "I must say," she began, voice sweet as syrup, "you wear my face with more grace than I expected." I rose slowly. "Jiran." She stepped closer, her lover trailing behind like a shadow in perfume. His gaze was disinterested, flicking across the room like someone inspecting a stage set. Only Jiran's eyes stayed locked on mine. "I should have expected it. You were always lurking behind the curtains, weren't you?" she said softly. "Always watching, copying. How clever of you to step into my life the moment I left it warm." "I didn't ask for this," I replied, voice calm, steady, though my chest felt like it would collapse. She tilted her head. "No, but you didn't refuse it either, and now it's mine again." My hands curled into fists behind the folds of my sleeves. "I'll give you one chance to disappear," she said. "Walk away, and I won't expose you for the little fraud you are." "And if I don't?" She leaned in, her smile brittle. "I'll tell Day One everything. I'll see to it you're arrested for impersonating a noble and paraded through the capital as the liar you are, and he..." She glanced toward the hallway, where his presence lingered like an echo. "He will let it happen." I couldn't breathe. Not fully. And in that moment, I believed her. Later that night, I packed, silently, quickly. I wrapped each charcoal stick in silk, folded my sketches into layers of linen, tucked the last of my drawings behind the hem of my traveling robe. I didn't cry. There was no time for that. Only motion. I had survived most of my life by knowing when to leave before being dragged out. As I tied the cord around my satchel, the door behind me opened. I froze, and then I heard his voice. "You didn't even say goodbye." I turned slowly. Daewon stood in the doorway, rain soaking the hem of his outer robe. His eyes were unreadable again, but not cold, not cruel. Something quieter flickered in them. I tried to speak, couldn't. He stepped into the room. "You were going to leave without telling me?" he said again, softer now. Was I so easy to deceive? I lowered my gaze. She's back. The real bride. The name you signed, the one they expect. "And you believe I can't tell the difference?" His words stopped my breath. I looked up. "I've known," he said. I stood in silence as his words settled into the space between us, soft and sharp all at once. I knew the moment you didn't touch the instrument she used to love. The moment you sketched the training field instead of sipping tea in the garden. I watched you change the way the soldiers moved. I read every page you left in your desk, even the ones you hid under the tray. You read my sketchbooks? He nodded. I read the satire first, then the portraits, then the piece you tore out. My knees gave way, and I sat slowly. Not out of surrender, but because I couldn't carry the weight of being known. You let it happen, I whispered. You let me lie. I let myself breathe. He crouched down before me, not touching me, only meeting my gaze without a wall between us. You gave them peace, but more than that, you gave me truth. I felt the tears before they reached my eyes, not from fear, from recognition. He didn't reach for me. Instead, he said the words that shattered the last of the mask I wore. You're not Jiran, I know. His voice didn't waver. And I stayed. The rain had stopped by morning, but the scent lingered. Wet stone, pine bark, and the bitter edge of something that had broken but not shattered. I sat by the window, staring at my satchel, half-packed, forgotten in the corner. Awan's words still pressed against the walls of my chest like a slow drumbeat. You're not Jiran, I know, and I stayed. He had left the room after saying it, leaving silence behind him like a seal. I hadn't moved since. I traced the wood grain beneath my fingertips, watching the morning mist dissolve across the estate roofs. The world outside looked the same, but something inside me was tilting. Sun settled. Not with fear, with choice. If I stay now, whose decision is it? When Daewon returned, he didn't knock. He stood at the doorway the same way he always did. Spine straight, eyes calm, hands folded behind him. But there was something different in his stillness now. He didn't speak at first. He walked across the room and set a scroll on the table between us. Sealed. Official. Embossed with the mark of the ministry. The Hay family has begun proceedings, he said. They're accusing you of fraud, impersonation, defamation of their name. I met his gaze. I expected that. I'm sure you did. He sat across from me, his robe trailing softly along the mat, no armor, no rank on display. Only his voice remained sharp. You could run, I wouldn't stop you. I swallowed the ache at the back of my throat. But you didn't come here to let me go. His eyes didn't blink. No? The silence was different this time. Heavy, but not cold. Waiting. He leaned forward slightly, his voice a shade lower. If we hide now, they win. They'll reclaim the narrative. They'll call you an imposter and me a fool, and the story will calcify into fact. And if we don't? He didn't hesitate. Let them bring the trial, he said. We'll bring the truth. I studied him. The man I had watched from the garden path. The figure I had drawn and burned. The name I had feared to say aloud, even in my own heart. And now, here he was, offering me the stage. Not as a shield, and not as a pawn. As myself. But still, I hesitated. Why? I whispered. You could have erased me easily. You knew I wasn't Jiran for weeks. Why let it continue? He didn't look away. Because the lie gave me quiet. But you gave me clarity. I couldn't speak, the words wouldn't form, so I stood. Instead, I walked to the far cabinet, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out a folded sheaf of parchment. My sketches, the uncensored ones, the satirical ones, the ones that could unmake names. I turned toward him. If I stand before them, I said softly, I do it in my name, not hers. I pause. I won't play Jiran in public. I won't recite a script written for someone I never was. I wouldn't ask you to. My fingers tightened around the papers. I won't plead for forgiveness, I continued. If I speak, it will be to name them, to tell everything, not just what they did to me, but what they've done to everyone. He nodded once. I wouldn't want anything less. That night, the estate prepared for the storm, not outside, but within. Servants whispered as messengers galloped toward the Capitol Court. The council chamber was notified. The press was alerted. The noble families who once toasted Juron's name began to whisper it like a disease. In the western wing, I was given a robe of pale ink blue. Modest, quiet. Unlike the gowns Juron used to wear, there was no jewelry, only a sash tied tight at the waist. I sat before the mirror, staring at the reflection that no longer felt foreign. The face hadn't changed, but the name would. I stepped into the receiving hall first. Alone. No escort, no trumpet, no pretense. Only the sound of my footsteps against polished stone and the weight of 1,000 stairs pressing into my spine like frost. The crowd parted slowly. Lawmakers, officials, nobles, press agents with ink-stained fingers and rumor-hungry eyes. The dais stood at the far end. High, impersonal. They had prepared it for scandal. They hadn't prepared it for defiance. I walked with my head held level, hands at my sides, sketchbook tucked beneath my arm like a blade. Daiwan appeared behind me moments later, dressed in formal navy robes, silver crest fastened cleanly at his collar. He didn't walk beside me. He walked behind me, like someone giving the space to be seen. The minister called my name, Lady Jiren of the Hay Line. I didn't respond. I stepped forward to the center of the room and said, "My name is Nairunhe. I was not the chosen bride. I was the shadow, the backup, the one you weren't meant to see." Gasps rippled across the room. I didn't flinch. "I accept your charges," I said, "but before you decide who I am, let me show you." I opened the sketchbook and began. The moment my name echoed through the hall, Nairunhe. I felt the air shift. It wasn't the sharp inhalations from nobles, or the rustle of satin skirts and stiff collars turning to whisper. It was something deeper, like the floor itself paused, unsure whether to hold me or let me fall. The tribunal chamber had been designed for grandeur, arched ceilings painted with ancestors who had judged 100 others before me. Gilded panels along the walls bore the crests of the old families. Rows of spectators loomed above us in tiers, hungry for spectacle cloaked in law. And I stood alone at the center, surrounded by power I was never supposed to touch. But look, I lifted my sketchbook and opened it to the first page. The trial began with the accusations. Aunt Hay spoke first. She was draped in mourning colors, though no one had died. Her voice trembled, perfectly practiced tremble. "This girl stole the name of my daughter, deceived a general, embarrassed the court." She gestured to the letters in her hand. Fabricated correspondence between me and a list of underground contacts. Forged, sloppily. I recognized the ink. Juron had always pressed too hard when she wrote lies. "She seduced General Daewon under false pretenses. She claims loyalty, but her past is littered with crimes. She is Yoon." Yes. Murmurs. The court turned its gaze back to me, now sharpened with suspicion. A judge in silver robes looked over his glasses, voice cool. "Do you deny being Yoon?" I looked up. "I confirm it." Another wave of shock. A nobleman whispered, "Brazen." A court lady covered her mouth with her fan. Still, I didn't flinch. I was Yun before I was Naiyun. I was Yun when your sons laughed at peasants behind scrolls. I was Yun when your daughters paid me to sketch their enemies in cruel glory. I was Yun because I was not permitted to be anything else. Step forward. I didn't come here to defend. I came to confess. The courtroom went still. From the folds of my robe, I withdrew the sealed archive. Dozens of folded papers, pressed flat, each page bearing satire that had been banned, bought, feared. Every image bore a coded truth, names hidden in symbols, faces stretched into grotesque reflections of reality, lies unmasked with ink. I laid them on the table. Each drawing is a record, each stroke born of a silence your courts refused to hear. I lifted one piece, A noble with 4 faces, each smiling at a different audience while stabbing a commoner behind a curtain. The Lord of the East Quarter funded illegal border raids. Here is his seal, twisted into the hilt. I turned the page. This councilwoman forced 8 girls into exile under the guise of education reform. Their initials are stitched into the pattern on her dress. Spoke without stutter, without apology, and the room began to change. Not loudly, but slowly. Some leaned forward, others grew still. They weren't looking at a liar anymore. They were looking at someone who saw them. The press tried to interrupt. Jiron had planted stories the night before, editorials claiming I had seduced Daewon, forged pregnancy records, ruined a diplomatic alliance. One newspaper printed a poem about wolves in silk. I read it aloud, smiling, then held up the original sketch it had stolen from Signed with My Seal years before. Your rumors can't outrun my ink. Even the judge let his mask falter, the corners of his mouth twitching before returning to stoicism. Toward the end, the nobles tried their final move. They summoned Daewon. He entered like a still wind, quiet, heavy, undeniable. His uniform bore no weapon, only the crest on his shoulder, pressed clean, perfectly straight. He took the stand. The prosecutor bowed. General Daewon, were you deceived by the accused? His eyes didn't leave mine. I knew who she was. The prosecutor blinked. You knew she was not Jiron of Hei? I knew she was Naeun of Hei. I knew she was Yun. I knew what she had done and what she had risked. The hall held its breath. I chose her knowing who she was, he said, voice like thunder over a still lake. And I will again. The chamber erupted, not with fury, with sound. Applause, disbelief, shouts of disbelief and awe. The gallery cried out. The judge called for silence. But truth had already pierced the walls. The Hay family's faces twisted. Aunt Hay's mouth opened without words. Jiren's eyes darted wildly, looking for an exit that didn't exist. The tribunal delivered its verdict at sunset. Charges of impersonation dropped. Charges of sedition invalidated. Counter-accusation of defamation and document forgery filed against the Hay family. Jiron's engagement claim was revoked. Their noble status stripped pending review. They leapt under guard. I stepped into the twilight alone. My hands still smelled faintly of ink. Behind me, the hall doors closed. Beside me, Daewon remained silent. He didn't speak until the last servant had passed and only cicadas remained between us. You fought in your own name, he said. I turned to him. I always have, I just hadn't said it out loud. He looked at me, then truly looked, as if seeing the girl behind the sketch, the rebel behind the robe. Good, he said softly. Then it's time the world learns how to listen. It rained on the day the school opened. Not heavily, but in a soft, insistent mist that blurred the rooftops and turned the garden stones silver. I stood by the entry gate, beneath the low arch carved with the words I had etched by hand. House of Quiet Ink. Not a name built from my family's ashes, not Daewon's title, mine. The path leading to the door was lined with pressed paper lanterns, shaped by small, careful hands. Girls from every corner of the province had come. Not daughters of generals or lords, but the overlooked ones. The quiet cousins. The ones taught to kneel before they could speak. Now they carried sketchbooks in place of fans, ink on their fingers instead of powdered blush. The staff bowed as I stepped forward, but I didn't need it. I wasn't here to be bowed to. I was here to begin. Inside, the main hall smelled of pressed mulberry and warm cedar. Scrolls hung along the walls, each one painted by a student. Not perfect, not polished, honest. A girl named Yuna had painted a woman with her mouth stitched closed, but her eyes open like fire. Another, Min, had drawn a garden filled with shadows in the shape of hands reaching for the sky. I ran my fingers across the edge of each frame like you might touch a friend's shoulder. The lines were raw, courageous. They reminded me of myself before I'd known I could be more than unseen. At the center of the room stood an empty easel. Waiting. I didn't have an answer until he arrived. I heard the soft scuff of his boots before I turned. Not the sound of a soldier, but of someone walking without intention to command. Iwan stood in the doorway, water beading at the edges of his cloak. He didn't wear his crest today. No sword at his hip, no gloves. His hands were bare. So were his eyes. He stepped into the light without ceremony, and in his hand, a folded sketch. Old. Familiar. I knew it before he spoke. You burned this once, he said quietly, his voice catching on something weightless. But I had it copied before the ink faded. He unfolded it carefully. The portrait of him, as I had once drawn him, not in armor, not commanding, but resting. Shadow falling across his face, jaw softened, breath halfway caught between duty and silence. I stared. I didn't think you'd kept it. I didn't want to let go of what it meant. He looked around the school, his gaze lingering on the paintings, the benches, the shelves filled with ink pots and half-finished sketches. You've built something rare here. I didn't reply, my throat ached. He stepped closer, and now I could see it in his hands. The way he held the portrait like it carried weight no soldier could train for. I've had many offers since the trial, he said slowly. Titles, seats, alliances. Of course you have. But I kept thinking about this drawing, he murmured, and what it meant that someone could see me like this, without judgment, without expectation. He looked at me then clearly, deeply. I don't want a contract, or a ceremony. I don't need you to kneel beside me or rise above me. I only want one thing. He held out the sketch. Your name beside mine. On the same page. I reached for the portrait. My fingers brushed his. The rain had slowed, leaving a hush outside the window, and within that stillness everything felt suspended, soft, unfinished, waiting for ink to settle on paper. Do you understand what that means? I asked, though my voice came out quieter than I intended. I do. It's not a vow of status. I don't want status. It's not legacy. I want your legacy beside mine, that's all. I studied him. He was the same man who had watched me from the corridor shadows, who had left me paper when words felt too dangerous, the one who had seen me first in a lie, and still chosen to stay. And now he stood before me with nothing to offer but his name, as it truly was. Not as a general, as day one. I smiled. You can sign your name below mine, then. His eyes flickered, amused, fond. He bowed his head, not in jest, but with the reverence of someone receiving a gift they never expected to deserve. Gladly. Later that evening, after the students had gone and the rooms quieted into twilight, I sat beside the open window, watching mist trail across the stones. The sketch lay on the table. I dipped my brush into fresh ink, then wrote my name, Nayarin, in the lower right. A pause. Daiwan took the brush from my hand, signed his beneath it, no flourish, no title. 2 names, side by side. Nothing hidden, not anymore. We are not born into purpose, we choose it. Narayan wasn't handed power or praise. She was handed silence, and she turned it into ink. She proved that identity isn't what others expect from you. It's what you claim even when no one claps. Even when the world calls you a mistake. So now we ask you, what name would you write beside your own if no one else could speak for you? Let us know in the comments. We read every word. And if this story stirred something in your chest, drop your answer, like the video, subscribe for more stories that speak your truth.